Hi, my name is Piotr Szlachtowicz and this is PSTV, and we're gonna record this interview fully in English today because our guest is a person who knows the stuff, especially about United States politics. I would call him insider, but I don't think he's gonna be happy about it. He knows he's a former U.S. diplomat, person who knows the stuff, and especially now is the time when we have a lot of complicated issues with the United States, especially in the politics. So my guest is Jim Jatras. Hello, sir. Welcome to our show.
Good. How are you? Good to be with you.
Thank you very much. Before I'm going to ask the first question, let me say a few things to our viewers. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like to help me out and support me in my work, this is the account you can do it. You can do so. You can support me financially if you think that all the things I do is good. You can support my independent journalism, or you can buy me simply a coffee under this address. I'll be much appreciated. That would be much appreciated. So thank you very much for that, Mr. Jatras. Thanks. First question. It's gonna be probably difficult one. Who runs the United States now?
I don't think anybody quite knows. I think that's the question people have been asking themselves, especially since the palace coup that removed Joe Biden and installed Kamala Harris as the Democratic nominee. I mean, obviously the people who run the country know who they are, but I think to a great extent what we're looking at is something like the old Soviet nomenclatura that is a very widespread, I don't want to say class, but let's say category of people that are through, obviously centered within what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, particularly within the intelligence agencies, but also the Pentagon and Wall Street and Hollywood and the media and so forth. I mean, it's kind of a privileged class of people that hold all the levers of power and are behaving with a kind of a mix between self-interest and various ideological agendas that they might have that involve, first off, the perpetuation of a global American empire, or using the United States in a sense as a base for their global empire in the same way that the communists use Russia as a base for their empire for many decades. So I think we have this group of people that have a kind of a winnowing process, a process of being having qualification and weeding out people who don't really belong. That's why, for example, somebody like Colonel Douglas MacGregor would never have become a general, or certainly not a high-ranking member of the establishment, because he didn't play ball with whatever their agenda was. So I think that you're going to get that kind of perpetuation of a privileged group of people that really call the shots, and it's very, very difficult for any president or anybody in the leadership class. Obviously, you have to consider Congress as part of this. As we all know, they're largely creatures of their donors and basically control what kind of legislation is produced by Congress. This is one reason, for example, why when Donald Trump was president, he wasn't really able to accomplish very much, because he did not effectively control even the executive branch of government when he was president. That was all controlled by the permanent government, the steady state, as some people call it, that has doing things and is not amenable to change.
Yeah, Trump. That's another question. I mean, I have a million questions about this topic, but the thing is does he have any chance to change it now? Even if they let him to run in the presidential elections, does he have a chance to change anything? Does Americans have a chance to change their country, regain the country, I would say?
That's a tough question. I think the short answer, unfortunately, is no to pretty much everything you just asked. Look, some people thought that even when Trump won in 2016, that he was some kind of a plant by some faction of the deep state, and I don't think that's true. I think his win was an accident of some sort, that they did not take him seriously. Remember, these people are so alienated from the rest of our country, or at least from the more traditional parts of the population, they really don't understand them. And I don't think they saw Trump coming. Well, they certainly saw him after he got into office and would find out a way to get him out of there. You asked the question in the right way, by the way, if they let him win. I can remember I arrived in Belgrade the day after the 2022 congressional election. And the first question people asked me from the media was, Mr. Jatras, was this election also stolen? Which means that they understood that that's what happened in 2020 and that's what happened in 2022. I don't think anybody can realistically have any confidence that America has fair elections anymore, especially at the presidential level. Let's remember that America does not have a single national election. We have 50 state elections. And of course, in each of those states, except for 2 of them, the winner of that state takes all that state's electoral votes. And that means if you can get the right number of votes in the right precincts within those states, you can win that state. Take a state like Pennsylvania, for example, which is key to any victory, especially for the Republicans, which is if you can get the right number of votes made to order from a very corrupt city like Philadelphia, you're going to win Pennsylvania. And if you win Pennsylvania, you're probably going to win the election. So this is the way these things work. If he does manage to win, and by the way, backing up a little bit, I think there's essentially 3, maybe 4 ways of dealing with Trump. Plan A was lawfare, to try to disqualify him from being on the ballot with these phony criminal cases against him. That doesn't seem to be working. I wouldn't say it's entirely dead, but that was the preferred method of keeping him out from possibly contesting the election. The second one is the one where I think we're looking at now, which is to manipulate the polls, manipulate the media in a way that sets the stage for a repeat of 2020 and 2022, which is what's most likely to happen. The third way is the one we also almost saw in Pennsylvania a few weeks ago, about which the less said, the better. The fourth way is that some faction of the deep state, maybe one that is more focused on Iran and China rather than on Russia, may prefer Trump to win. But that means that they're going to have to fight against other factions that are more terrified of him because of what they perceive to be the domestic consequences. I don't think that one is very likely, but it can't be ruled out. In any case, if he does win, if he's allowed to win and becomes president again, I think it's going to be just a very bad replay of what happened when he had the Oval Office the first time around. Yes, some of the crazier things the Democrats do about, women, men dressed up in women and things like that will take a back seat if Trump is president. But there's all the indications are he learned nothing from his first time around, that his appointees will be horrible, just like they were the first time around, and that he will be boxed in by all the other elements of the establishment that will keep him from departing too much from the established script.
Because when I'm watching independent journalists, American independent journalists, and in the whole area, they have like Alex Jones, whatever, Tucker Carlson, whatever, the others, Redacted, etc., etc. They have a huge hope that is something's going to change, but you now just demolish that all. But in some ways, reality is a reality. That's why I'm so glad to talk to you, because you're a former diplomat, so you know how it works from the inside out. Do you think that if something happens to Trump, there might be even a revolution, or it's just now nothing's gonna happen, and deep state is gonna win anyway?
I think it's highly unlikely. I think it's highly unlikely, and here's why. I think we touched on it a little earlier with respect to you mentioned in Poland that the same challenge faces the American people as reflects the people confronts the people of Poland or England or France or Germany or Spain, all the European countries, and I consider at least culturally America to be essentially a European country. That there's a very low level of national consciousness in America. When I say nationalist, I mean in terms of a people, an ethnos. Poles, at least a lot of them still know that they're Poles. Russians know they're Russians, Germans know they're Germans, French know they're French. Not all of them, but a substantial portion of them. Very few Americans have that consciousness. If you ask an American what makes you an American, he thinks in terms primarily of civic identity, of being a citizen of a state under a constitution. And when you try to convince him that, you know what, that doesn't exist anymore. We don't live in a rule of law state anymore. Our constitution is not really in force anymore. He just can't deal with it. It's not part of his consciousness. He has no idea who he is outside of that constitution. Poland is not dependent on what's written in its constitution. It's had several constitutions during its history. But what makes Poland Poland is Poles, Polish people. Americans are not conscious of that. They've bought this notion that we're a civic state, not an ethnic state. This notion that we're a nation of immigrants, which is not really true either. And so when everything falls apart, they don't know what to do. Their only response is, well, Trump 2028, let's vote harder next time. Let's reform the electoral system, which of course isn't going to happen. And so I think if Trump loses, or more properly, if the election is taken away from him, they will simply not know what to do. They will respond with what we call cognitive dissonance. They simply will not be able to assimilate the fact that the republic in which they think they're living, in which no longer really exists, doesn't exist anymore, and they will simply be left without any options.
Okay, so that's why Democrats are so, I wouldn't say, no, they're so sure about the outcome of presidential elections.
Yes.
If you look at it now of Kamala Harris, these polls, they are rising, they're going up. So no matter what, no matter how many Americans will stand up for Trump, anyway, they're going to win. So, but just so. You said it is no conscience about it, but so what will happen if they're going to carry on? The Democrats are going to win, and we're going to have United States of Communism, or Communism of the United States, because that's what is going to happen when Kamala Harris is going to take power, or whatever. Yeah. So what's going to be then with all these people who still, seeing themselves as a free Americans who love their country?
Well, I think what's going to happen to a lot of those Americans is something that's already been happening for several years, is where to the extent possible, they tune out and withdraw from the system. They maybe move to a rural area. They become survivalists. They collect a lot of, food and, guns and ammunition, which of course we do have in this country, and they try to get away from it as much as possible. Unfortunately, most people cannot pull out or secede from the system in that way. I would say if everything was left as it stands now, the glide path for America and Americans is downward, is kind of disappearing under the woke waves, never to be seen again. And look, this has been coming for decades. I wrote an article in 1998 called Rainbow Fascism at Home and Abroad, about how this kind of ideology was taking over the United States and spreading itself across the world. However, and there's a footnote here, one way in which this may not continue down that glide path is not that we're going to vote our way out of it, because we're not going to, but that the domestic trends in the United States are inseparable from the what I call the global American empire, the GAY, the idea that this class can try to dominate the world using the United States as its base. If that enterprise fails, and I think it is in the process of failing, not only in Ukraine, but in the Middle East and in the Western Pacific, confronting China, if that global empire collapses, I think that will also unravel the power of the ruling nomenclatura here inside the United States, in the same way that the collapse of the Soviet Empire as an international force led inevitably to its collapse domestically. And if that happens, and it very well may happen, then I think all bets are off, that everything starts to become dysfunctional, that the primacy of the dollar, for example, no longer supports a standard of living that is way above the productive capacity of the United States, that things like supply chains begin to break down. If supply chains break down, the first thing that will go will be the supplies of food and other essentials in the cities. What's going to happen in American cities when that happens? So we could have some kind of an explosion here in the United States, but it won't be, strictly speaking, a political explosion. You know, the Trump supporters take to the streets because Trump was robbed again. That's not going to happen. But what could happen is some kind of a domestic, economic, political, social crisis that, again, the word collapse keeps coming to mind, that creates a state of emergency, of crisis, that has no leadership, no real direction in any coherent way. And I don't think anybody can foresee what the consequences of that will be.
In some ways, I agree. When I see at Poland, I think it has to collapse and rebuild itself, because there is no other way. There's someone show up and going to rebuild it. With all due respect for Donald Trump, I don't think he's going to be able, in any ways, to rebuild America and make America great again. What do you think about that?
No, I don't think he's going to make America great again. No, I don't think so. Even if he wins, as I say. But and by the way, if he does win, to the flip side of your question, I think this country is going to burn. If Trump wins, we're going to see disorders in America that make 2020 and Black Lives Matter and Antifa and all of that look like a picnic. That it's going to be a great, that itself will be a catalyst for whatever collapse of America may occur. You know, I wrote a piece in I guess 2017 called Mikhail Octavian Trump. The idea that Trump was elected to be a kind of an Octavian figure, to realize that the American Republic was in crisis, like the Roman Republic was in crisis, and the only way to restore it is to trash what cannot survive and to try to save what can be still viable. But instead, he turned out to be more of a Mikhail Gorbachev type figure, that he was tasked with saving a system that was in crisis, and instead he became a catalyst, kind of like an orange Gorbachev, that will accelerate the unraveling of the system.
Jim, the world is changing. The power, I mean, is going to East. Yeah, I mean, to Asia.
Yeah.
And I have this kind of impression that American establishment doesn't want to accept it, doesn't want to see it even. What do you think about that? That even the deep state hasn't come to the conclusion that our time is gone, and we're not a superpower, the most important country in the world. Do you agree?
Yes, I do agree. You would think that particularly in the financial sector, there would be some element of that establishment that says, you know what, we're not living in the same post-Cold War era that we were, the unipolar moment and all of that for the, in the 90s especially. And if we want to keep our money and keep our resources, we're going to find some way to get on board with the Eurasian camp and whatever comes after this, a BRICS currency or whatever it might be. You'd think they'd be finding some way to go forward with that, just to save their own wealth and privileges. Never mind what happens to the United States, what happens to the American empire. And maybe some of them are doing that. But by and large, most of these people, as you say, do not see it, much less are willing to accept it. And that's why we see, for example, this constant escalation in Ukraine with a war that clearly cannot be won. I mean, I think the Russians have made it very, very clear that whatever happens in Ukraine, they cannot accept a defeat in Ukraine, because that would be an existential threat to their nation. And however much we escalate, they will have to match that escalation in some way. I think there are other problems with the way Moscow is approaching this, but I think that that's the case. Well, we're throwing the same sort of challenge in front of Iran and in the Middle East with our complete blanket support for Mr. Netanyahu and whatever his agenda is, which is personal as much as it is national. And we're also looking for some way to preserve our supremacy in the Western Pacific, even though anybody with any common sense realizes that that's not possible, given the increasing economic and even military strength of China, especially in its alliance with Russia. You'd think that these realities would be, coming up and biting them on the rear end, and oh, wait a minute, I guess we have to change our path. They don't know how to do it. They're like a big dumb dinosaur. Again, maybe I'm wearing out this comparison to the Soviet nomenclatura, but just like that nomenclatura, which really couldn't change because there were so many millions of people that were integrated into that structure, and it was not capable of changing. It was like a big, huge ship that could only change very, very slightly in its course based on existential circumstances. But if something terrible arose and they had to turn sharply, it's just not capable of doing that. And in fact, maybe that's one of the factors of this nomenclature that is so diffuse, so big, so broad, that there is no single actor within it, or even a small group of actors within it could say, wait a minute, emergency ahead, change course. There's nobody who can do that. So we just keep going forward as, the iceberg approaches.
I can confirm that by the look of four, Polish politicians who still are in Cold War, end of it, Reagan times.
Yeah.
And then just like they don't want to change the course, they don't want to open their minds for something else, that the world is changing and everything's going to east. And we need to establish our position as a Poland who have terrific geopolitical, place, and you can use it a lot for our benefit, but they don't want to see it. They have this American point of view. But I want to ask you about Ukraine, about this Kursk attack on Kursk area by Ukrainian army. What's the purpose of it, in your opinion?
Before answering that question, let me just add a footnote here. When I was at the State Department, I served on what was called the Soviet desk, the Office of Soviet Union Affairs. And back at that time, and this is during the Reagan administration, you would think that anti-Sovietism and anti-communism was really a big thing in those circles, but it was not. I mean, there was generally kind of a soft respect for and even affection for the Soviet government as, well, not that too different from us. Same kind of values, atheist, progressive, materialistic, socialist. Well, it's bad, of course, because they're Russians and everybody knows Russians are bad, but it's not like we have a real problem with it. As soon as communism ended, that changed radically, that people who had been mildly favorable toward the Soviet Union became radically anti-Russian, because at least with the Soviets and communism, you could say, well, they're still sort of people like us. But once Russia became a state that was based more on national values and even to some extent on Orthodox Christian values, then the red flag really went up, the warning flag. I mean, that's why you see, Putin demonized in a way that nobody ever demonized Brezhnev or Khrushchev or not even Stalin. And I think that's partly because they see the rise of, if you will, civilizational states like Russia, like China, like Iran, as a threat to their, globo homo homogenization of all human culture and subordination to these post-human values. So that's why I think is ultimately at the root of the conflicts we're seeing today. Now, to address Kursk, I don't know, I can only try to keep up with some people who maybe know more of the details than I do are saying, but it seems that there were a couple of things going on. One is that they hope to seize the Kursk nuclear plant and use that as some kind of a bargaining chip to negotiate over exchanging with the Zaporozhye plant or something like that. The other bigger purpose, of course, is that since Kiev has been fighting largely a propaganda war rather than a military war. They hope to be able to seize part of Russian territory and say, look, we're winning, we can still win this. Please send us more weapons. Please escalate all that stuff you say you wouldn't give us because it will mean World War III. Well, give that to us anyway so we can take the fight to the Russians. So I think that's what they're doing, at least for the time being on the propaganda front. That seems to be working. Some people say the Russians let this happen on purpose to suck in most of the still capable Ukrainian forces so they could destroy them. I suppose that's possible, but I have trouble believing that's what happened. But maybe it happened in that case. I think what really comes down to now is how much the Ukrainians stripped down the rest of their forces in the Donbass and elsewhere to equip this incursion into Russia. We are already seeing an acceleration of the Russian forces along that broader front, and then how long this incursion into Russian territory is allowed to continue by the Kremlin. And I don't have the answer to that. It really gets back to the bigger question: what is the strategy in Moscow? And I don't know what it is. I mean, some of them seem to think that the longer they keep this war going on, the better off they are, because it leads to more and more degradation of the Western structures like NATO and the European Union. In my opinion, that's a mistaken strategy from their point of view, that they're basically opening the door to further and further escalation, that if this is still going on by the middle of next year, I don't see how a general European war between NATO and Russia can be avoided.
All right. Yeah, but do you see that some really huge chances for escalation? Because now I hear that Putin is moving the troops from Kaliningrad district to Kursk district, and now we're gonna have, because he cannot keep it like this, he has to stop it, because he looks really bad in eyes of the Russian public, Russians' opinion. So do you think it's might cause escalation? One of the people I interview, one of the professors here, said it could even cost to use by Russians tactical atomic bomb, like a small one, of course, just to stop some things. But maybe that's not going to happen. Hopefully it's not going to happen, but you never know. Russians are strong kind of people.
Well, I don't know why they would do that. We've heard this talk over the last few days about the potential of a dirty bomb. And we'd heard that a few months ago, people speculating, oh, the Russians might want to use a dirty bomb or a small tactical nuke. And the question is, why would they do that? I mean, they've got militarily the upper hand. Why would they do that unless somehow they're losing, they're in desperate circumstances? I don't see that they are. I mean, they still have, in terms of military materiel, vastly more than what the Ukrainians have. Their manpower situation is far less desperate than that of the Ukrainians. Unless we see tens of thousands of, NATO troops coming into Ukraine, Poles, Americans, British, whoever else. And we know there are some of them there, but I don't think we have the numbers to put in there to actually make a big difference on the Ukrainian battlefields. So I don't know why the Russians would do that. I'd be much more concerned that the NATO side would do something like that as a provocatia to say, oh, look what the Russians did. I think that's been a danger all along here. But I think the bigger question is, in their overall strategy, it seems that not just Russia, but Putin particularly, as somebody who's always been a cautious person, and generally, let's not forget, pro-Western in his outlook, wants to proceed very carefully, walking on eggshells, not to do anything provocative that might lead to escalation, and that eventually somebody in the West will come to the table and will make some sort of a diplomatic deal. People tell me he's no longer thinking that way, but I don't really know. I mean, other people that I hear from Moscow tell me that nobody is in charge, nobody has a plan, there's no strategy, they're simply reacting to events. And if that's the case, I think the potential that this thing escalates and blows up on all of our faces is very, very high. If I were in their situation, I would try to wrap this up as soon as possible. And to me, that wrapping that up means the end of the Ukrainian state. And then at that point, NATO's escalation options are much, much smaller, unless somebody is actually crazy enough to launch a direct attack against Russia from NATO territory. Then they're sort of out of options at that point. But again, I think we're all sort of speculating here. What a lot of it comes down to is there's probably about 10 guys in the Kremlin who know what really is going on over there, and they're not talking.
That's for sure. Okay. But we have another problem from the American point of view, from, let's say, free society point of view. Palestine, the genocide of their, of Palestinians. But on the other hand, do you think this conflict with Iran, Israel contra Iran, will involve United States in a high level?
It's quite possible. I mean, I've ever since this crisis began in October of last year, this latest round of the crisis, I've been of the view that the only way that Mr. Netanyahu can save his skin politically and possibly physically is to escalate to the point where there is a direct conflict between the United States and Iran. I mean, that's the holy grail for him. And frankly, for the most aggressive elements inside the United States, especially the neoconservatives, mainly in the Republican Party, but to a great extent in the Democratic Party too. And that was the purpose of his visit here to Washington a few weeks ago, to get firm assurances mostly from people in Congress that he virtually owns, that if there is a conflict between Iran and Israel, the United States will come to Israel's rescue. There may be some in the establishment that would like to limit the extent to which we get involved in that and not directly have a war between the United States and Iran. I don't think that's possible if this conflict breaks out. And I think that's why we've seen these provocations from the Israeli side to force the Iranians to respond. The trouble is, it puts the Iranians in the same situation as the Russians are, is that the less they respond to the provocations, the more the other side is encouraged to keep escalating the level of their provocations. There have been reports that the Russians are trying to talk the Iranians out of responding to the two assassinations, the one in Lebanon, the other one in Tehran. Because, well, look, you're winning. The Israelis are bogged down in Gaza. They're bleeding to death there. They're bleeding to death in the north, where they've had to evacuate hundreds of thousands of people from northern Israel because of the threat from Hezbollah. Things are heating up in the West Bank. You know, when your opponent is in the process of destroying himself, don't interrupt him. And that's what they'll be telling them. The trouble is, for the Iranians, that means that if Bibi didn't get his war with Iran with this assassination, who's he going to kill next? What will he do next to get what he wants? And I think that's the dilemma that's facing the people in Tehran.
Okay, more question about Israel. Because people in Poland doesn't want to believe it. Does it really, Netanyahu or Israel state, have a majority of most influential politicians in the United States in his pocket?
Oh, oh yeah, of course. You know, there's one commentator of Russian origin here in the United States. I don't want to name him because I don't want to make it personal, but he keeps saying, "Oh, the Israelis own half of Congress," and my response is, half. They own like 99.7% of Congress. I mean, they totally control Congress. I mean, the only people they don't totally control are the so-called, squad, people like AOC and a few others, and what I call the Afro-Islamic Antifa wing of the Democratic Party, who at least pretend not to be pro-Israel, although they know also that that's got to be the direction of American policy. It's just they have a slightly different tribal interest than the one that governs the rest of Congress. Obviously you have an awful lot of Jewish money that goes into the pockets of both parties. You also have on the Republican side what they call, Christian Zionists, which is that these are American Christians, largely evangelical Protestants, who literally think that supporting the Israeli state is standing with God. And some of them even have this notion that by supporting Israel and rebuilding the third temple or whatever it is, that they're going to help hasten the return of Christ, which, as any traditional Christian knows, means opening the door for the appearance of Antichrist. But that, that's a whole nother topic. The bottom line is, yes, 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 Israel owns Congress. And also, let's keep in mind, based on what we were talking about earlier, I think this is also something that is apparent to Mr. Trump and his camp, that the only way he would be allowed to win is if some faction of the deep state that is focused on Israel and on Iran lets him win, and they can prevail over other elements of the deep state that maybe are not as keenly focused on that issue as opposed to Russia or China or domestic concerns.
Thank you very much. This is what the answer I expected, really. But still, people don't want to believe it. Jim Jatras, former U.S. diplomat, was a guest star in our show. Thank you very much for this interview, sir.
Thank you, Piotr. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, me too, sir. Guys, if you want to support my work, you see the details above it. You can see it, of course, above the whole conversation of ours. And if you want to just support in the other way, you can always buy me a coffee under this address. Thank you very much. Pass it forward, subscribe to the channel. Let the truth goes. We don't have much time because they're going to do censorship sooner or later, total censorship. But let the truth go further. I'm asking you for that. Thank you very much. That was an interview with Jim Jatras, former U.S. diplomat. All the best. We'll see you on another show. Bye bye.